Stars in Their Corses. The Gettysburg Campaign, June and July, 1863. By Shelby Foote. Read for you by the author.
Whatever lack of nerve or ingenuity had been demonstrated in Mississippi throughout the long, hot, hungry weeks that Vicksburg shuddered under assault and languished under siege, there had been no shortage elsewhere in the Confederate States of either of these qualities on which the beleaguered city's hopes were hung. Indeed, a sort of inverse ratio seemed to obtain between proximity and daring, as if distance not only lent enchantment, but also encouraged boldness, so far at least as the Western theater was concerned. A case in point was P.G.T. Beauregard, 650 airline miles away on the eastern seaboard. Charleston's two-time savior was nothing if not inventive, especially when he had time on his hands, as he did now. In mid-May, with the laurel still green on his brow for the repulse of Samuel DuPont's ironclad fleet the month before, he unfolded in a letter to the regional commander, Joseph E. Johnston, with whom he'd shared the triumph of Manassas back in the first glad summer of the war, and to whom, under pressure from Richmond, he had just dispatched 8,000 of his men, a plan so sweeping in its concept that the delivery of the Gibraltar of the West, whose plight had started him thinking along these lines, was finally no more than an incidental facet of a design for sudden and absolute victory over all the combinations whereby the North intended to subjugate the South. According to his general views of the coming summer campaign, propounded in a letter to his friend, Johnston would be reinforced by troops from all the other Confederate commanders, who would stand on the defensive east and west, while Johnston joined Braxton Bragg south of Nashville for an all-out offensive against the Union center, wrecking William S. Rosecrans and driving the frazzled remnant of his army beyond the Ohio. Johnston would follow, picking up 10,000 recruits in Middle Tennessee and another 20,000 in Kentucky. And if this threat to the federal heartland had not already prompted a withdrawal by the Bluecoats from in front of Vicksburg, he could march west to the Mississippi above Memphis and thus cut off Grant's communications with the North. When the besiegers moved upriver, as they would be obliged to do for want of supplies, Johnston would draw them into battle on a field of his choice, and the result could not be doubtful for an instant. With Ulysses S. Grant thus disposed of, the victorious Southern Army of the Center, some 150,000 strong by then, could split in two, one half crossing the Big River to assist Kirby Smith and Sterling Price in the liberation of Louisiana and Missouri, while the other half joined Robert E. Lee in Virginia to complete the terrible lesson the enemy has just had at Chancellorsville. Meanwhile, by way of Lagniappe, a fleet of special torpedo boats would be constructed in England, from designs already at hand in Charleston, to steam westward across the Atlantic and re-secure the Mississippi upwards from its mouth. The war would be over, won. Thus Beauregard. But after waiting 5 weeks and receiving no sign that his suggestions had been received, much less adopted, he felt, as he told another friend, like Samson shorn of his locks. Time was slipping away, he complained in a postscript to his retained copy of the letter, despite the fact that the whole of this brilliant campaign, which is only indicated here, could have been terminated by the end of June. On July 1st, he heard at last from Johnston, though only on an administrative matter and without reference to his proposals of mid-May. Assuming that the original must have gone astray, he sent him at once a copy of the letter, together with the postscript stressing the need for haste in the adoption of the plan, which he called brilliant. "I fear, though, it is now too late to undertake it," he admitted, and added rather lamely, "I hope everything will yet turn out well, although I do not exactly see how." Nothing came of the Creole general's dream of reversing the blue flood, first in the center and then on the left and right. But others with easier access to the authorities in Richmond had been making similar, if less flamboyant, proposals all the while. James Longstreet, for example, on his way to rejoin Lee in early May, hard on the heels of Chancellorsville and the aborted siege of Suffolk, outlined for Secretary of War James A. Seddon a plan not unlike Beauregard's, except that it had the virtue of comparative simplicity. It was old Peter's conviction that the only way to equalize the contest was by skillful use of our interior lines. And in this connection, he proposed that Johnston give over any attempt to go directly to John C. Pemberton's assistance at Vicksburg and instead reinforce Bragg at Tullahoma, while Longstreet, with his 2 divisions now en route from Suffolk under John B. Hood and George E. Pickett, moved by rail to that same point for that same purpose. Rosecrans would be swamped by overwhelming numbers, and the victors then could march for the Ohio. Grant's being the only force that could be used to meet this threat, his army would be withdrawn upriver, and Vicksburg thereby would be relieved. Seddon listened attentively. Though he liked the notion of using Hood and Pickett to break the enemy's grip on the Mississippi south of Memphis, he preferred the more direct and still simpler method of sending them southwestward for a movement against Grant where he then was. However, this presupposed the approval of Lee, which was not forthcoming. Lee replied that he would, of course, obey any order sent him, but he considered the suggestion less than wise. The adoption of your proposition is hazardous, he wired Seddon, and it becomes a question between Virginia and the Mississippi. The date was May 10th. Stonewall Jackson died that afternoon, but Lee suppressed his grief in order to expand his objections to the Secretary's proposal in a letter that same Sunday. He not only thought the attempt to rescue Pemberton by sending troops from Virginia unduly risky, he also considered it unnecessary. I presume the reinforcements would not reach him until the last of this month, he wrote. If anything is done in that quarter, it will be over by that time, as the climate in June will force the enemy to retire. Seddon doubted that climate alone would be enough to cause the Federals to abandon, even for a season, their bid for source-to-mouth control of the Mississippi. Whatever Lee might think of Grant, the Secretary considered him such an obstinate fellow that he could only be induced to quit Vicksburg by terribly hard knocks. In fact, that had been his objection to Longstreet's claim that a strike at Rosecrans would abolish the threat downriver. Grant might simply ignore the provocation and refuse to loosen his grip. Jefferson Davis agreed. Moreover, he shared Seddon's reservations about Johnston, who had just been ordered to the Mississippi capital, as a deliverer of hard knocks. Between them, under pressure of the knowledge that something had to be done, and done quickly, now that the Bluecoats were on the march in Pemberton's rear, the President and the Secretary decided that the time had come for a high-level conference to determine just what that something was to be. On May 14th, the day Johnston abandoned Jackson to Union occupation, they summoned Lee to Richmond for a full discussion of the problem. He arrived next day, which was one of sorrow and strain for the whole Confederacy. Stonewall Jackson was being buried out in the Shenandoah Valley, and Joe Johnston was retreating to Canton, a day's march north of the Mississippi capital, while Grant turned west for a leap at Vicksburg from the rear. Davis and Seddon hoped that face-to-face with Lee they might persuade him to continue the risk of facing Joseph Hooker with a depleted army so that Longstreet could join Johnston for a strike at Grant. However, they found him still convinced that such an attempt, undertaken for the possible salvation of the Mississippi for a season, would mean the loss of Virginia forever, and that for him was quite unthinkable. Save in defense of my native state, I'll never again desire to draw my sword, he had said 2 years ago on the day he resigned from the U.S. Army. Apparently he still felt that way about it, with one refinement. His proposal now, for he agreed that something drastic had to be done to reverse the blue flood of conquest in the center and on the far left of the 1,000-mile Confederate line of battle, was that he launch a second invasion of the North. The first, back in September, had come to grief in Maryland because of a combination of mishaps, not the least of which had been George McClellan's luck in finding the lost order issued by Lee when he snapped at the bait left dangling at Harper's Ferry. This time, though, he would profit by that experience. He would march without delay into Pennsylvania, deep in Washington's rear, where a victory might well prove decisive, not only in his year-long contest with the Army of the Potomac, in which he'd never lost a major battle, but also in the war. It might or might not cause the withdrawal of Grant from in front of Vicksburg, but at least it would remove the invaders from the soil of Virginia during the vital harvest season, while at best it would accomplish the fall of the northern capital and thus encourage the foreign intervention which Davis long had seen as the key to victory over the superior forces of the Union. The President and Seddon were impressed. Having heard Lee out, Davis asked him to return the following morning for a presentation of his views to the entire cabinet. That, too, was a critical day for the young republic. Before it was over, Grant had thrown Pemberton into retreat from Champion Hill, containing his lunge for the back door of Vicksburg, and Nathaniel Banks had ended his week-long occupation of Alexandria, Louisiana, in order to move against Port Hudson. Lee spent most of it closeted with Davis and the cabinet at the White House, presenting his solution to the national crisis. He spoke not in his former capacity as military advisor to the president, and certainly not as general-in-chief. No such office existed in the Confederacy. Henry Halleck's only counterpart was Davis, or at least a fraction of him, but rather as commander of the Department of Northern Virginia. Having rejected the notion of reinforcing Vicksburg, the distance and uncertainty of the employment of troops are unfavorable, he told Seddon. Lee based his present advice on what was good or bad for his department and the soldiers in his charge. I considered the problem in every possible phase, he subsequently explained, and to my mind it resolved itself into a choice of one of two things: either to retire to Richmond and stand a siege, which must ultimately have ended in surrender, or to invade Pennsylvania. Placed in that light, the alternatives were much the same as if the cabinet members were being asked to choose between certain defeat and possible victory. In fact, possible became probable with Robert E. Lee in charge of an invasion launched as the aftermath of Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville. Triumph scored against the same adversary and against longer odds than he would be likely to encounter when he crossed the Potomac with the reunited Army of Northern Virginia. Seddon and Secretary of State Judah P. Benjamin, Secretary of the Treasury Christopher G. Meminger, Attorney General Thomas H. Watts, and Secretary of the Navy Stephen R. Mallory all agreed with the gray-bearded general, whose fame, as one of them said, now filled the world. They were not only persuaded by his logic, they were awed by his presence, his aura of invincibility. And this included Davis, who had seldom experienced that reaction to any man. It did not include Postmaster General John H. Reagan. He was by no means persuaded by Lee, and such awe as he felt for any living man was reserved for Jefferson Davis, whom he considered self-made and practical-minded like himself. Born in poverty 45 years ago in Tennessee, Reagan had been a school teacher and a Mississippi plantation overseer before he was 18, when he moved to Texas with all he owned tied up in a kerchief. Passing the bar, he'd gone into Lone Star politics and in time won election to Congress, where service on the Postal Committee prepared him for his present assignment. In this, he already had scored a singular triumph, unequaled by any American postmaster in the past 75 years, or indeed in the next 100. Under Reagan's watchful eye, the Confederate Postal Department did not suffer an annual deficit, but yielded a clear profit. He accomplished this mainly by forcefulness and vigor, and now he employed those qualities in an attempt to persuade Davis and his fellow cabinet members that no victory anywhere, even in Washington itself, could offset the disaster that would result from the loss of the Mississippi. The only man present whose home lay beyond that river, he said plainly that he thought Lee was so absorbed in his masterful defense of Virginia that he did not realize the importance of the Trans-Mississippi, which would be cut off from the rest of the country with the fall of Vicksburg. It had been claimed that Lee's advance might result in Grant's withdrawal to meet the challenge, but Reagan did not believe this for an instant. Grant was committed, he declared. The only way to stop him from accomplishing his object was to destroy him, and the only way to destroy him was to move against him with all possible reinforcements, including Longstreet's 2 divisions from Lee's army. As for the talk of cooperation expected from those with anti-war sentiments in the North, this too had been advanced as an argument for invasion. The peace movement had been growing beyond the Potomac. Reagan agreed with Beauregard as to the probability that the threatened danger to Washington would arouse again the whole Yankee nation to renewed efforts for the protection of their capital. In short, he saw everything wrong with Lee's plan and everything right about the plan it had superseded. Grant was the main threat to the survival of the Confederacy, and it was Grant at whom the main blow must be aimed and struck. Davis and the others heard both men out, and when the two had had their say, a vote was taken. In theory, the cabinet could reject Lee's proposal as readily as that of any other department commander, Bragg or Pemberton or Beauregard, for example, each of whom was zealous to protect the interests of the region for which he was responsible. But that was only in theory. This was Lee, the first soldier of the Confederacy, the first soldier of the world, some would assert, and this was, after all, a military decision. The vote was 5-1 in the general's favor. Davis concurring, it was agreed that the invasion would begin at the earliest possible date. Pleased with the outcome and at the confidence expressed, Lee went that evening to pay his respects to a Richmond matron who had done much to comfort the wounded of his army. As he took his leave, it seemed to a young lady of the house, much as it had seemed earlier to 5 of the 6 cabinet members, that he was clothed in glory. It was broad moonlight, she was to write years later, and I recall the superb figure of our hero standing in a little porch without, saying the last few words as he swung his military cape around his shoulders. It did not need my fervid imagination to think him the most noble-looking mortal I'd ever seen. We felt, as he left us and walked on up the quiet, leafy street in the moonlight, that we'd been honored by more than royalty. Again, Reagan had a different reaction. Unable to sleep because of his conviction that a fatal mistake had been made that day at the White House, he rose before dawn. It was Sunday now, May 17th. Pemberton would be routed at high noon on the Big Black, and Johnston was advising the immediate evacuation of Vicksburg, to send a message urging Davis to call the cabinet back into session for a reconsideration of yesterday's decision. Davis did so, having much the same concern for Mississippi as Lee had for Virginia. His brother and sisters were there, along with many lifelong friends who had sent their sons to help defend the Old Dominion and now looked to him for deliverance from the gathering blue host. But the result of today's vote, taken after another long discussion, was the same as yesterday's, 5-1 against Reagan. Lee returned to the Rappahannock the following day, which was the first of many in the far-off siege of Vicksburg. The problems awaiting him at Fredericksburg were multitudinous and complex. Chancellorsville, barely 2 weeks in the past and already being referred to as Lee's masterpiece, had subtracted nearly 13,000 of the best men from his army. Of these, in time, about half would be returning, but the other half would not. And of these last, as all agreed, the most sorely missed was Jackson. Any victory would be dear at such a price, Lee declared. He found it hard to speak of him, so deep was his emotion at the loss. I know not how to replace him, he said. And indeed, he did not try. Instead, he reorganized the army, abandoning the previous grouping of the infantry into 2 corps of 4 divisions each for a new arrangement of 3 corps, each with 3 divisions. The new 9th Division, thus required, was created by detaching 2 brigades from A.P. Hill's so-called Light Division, the largest in the Army, and combining them with 2 brought up from Richmond and North Carolina. Henry Heath, Hill's senior brigadier, was given command, along with a promotion to Major General. Similarly, 1 division was taken from each of the 2 existing corps, Richard Anderson's from the 1st, and what was left of Hill's from the 2nd, in order to fill out the new 3rd. The problem of appointing corps commanders was solved with equal facility. Longstreet, of course, would remain at the head of the 1st Corps, whose composition was unchanged except for the loss of Anderson. Lafayette, McLaws, Pickett, and Hood were in command of their 3 divisions as before. The 2nd Corps went to Richard S. Ewell, Jackson's former chief subordinate, who opportunely returned to the Army at this time, having recovered from the loss of a leg 9 months ago at Groveton. A.P. Hill got the new Third Corps, which was scarcely a surprise. Lee had praised him weeks ago to Davis as the best of his division commanders, and moreover, a good half of the troops involved had been under him all along. Promotion to lieutenant general went to both Ewell and Hill. Jubal Early kept the division he had led since Ewell's departure, and W. Dorsey Pender succeeded Hill, under whom he'd served from the outset. He was promoted to Major General, as was Robert Rhodes, who was confirmed as commander of the division that had spearheaded the flank attack on Hooker. Edward Johnson, returning to duty after a year-long absence spent healing the bad leg wound he had suffered at McDowell, the curtain raiser for Jackson's Valley campaign, completed the roster of Corps and division commanders by taking over the 2nd Corps Division, which had been temporarily under Raleigh Colston. The artillery was reshuffled too, and the General Reserve abolished, so that each corps now had 5 battalions. William Pendleton, the former Episcopal rector, retained his assignment as chief of the Army's artillery, though the title was merely nominal now that the reserve battalions had been distributed, and he remained a brigadier. J.E.B. Stewart, on the other hand, gained 3 new brigades of Virginia cavalry brought in from various parts of the state in order to add their weight to the 3 he already had for the offensive. As a result of all these acquisitions, supplemented by volunteers and conscripts forwarded from all parts of the nation as replacements for the fallen, the Army was almost up to the strength that it enjoyed before the subtractions of Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville. Approximately 75,000 effectives. In round figures, 5,000 artillery, 10,000 cavalry, and 60,000 infantry stood in its ranks. The infantry order of battle was as follows: Longstreet, with the divisions of McLaws, Pickett, and Hood; Ewell, with Early, Johnson, and Rhodes; and A.P. Hill, with Anderson, Heath, and Pender. The arrangement seemed pat and apt enough, but there were those who had objections no less sharp for being silent. Longstreet, for instance, perhaps chagrined that Lee had not consulted him beforehand, resented Hill's promotion over the head of McLaws, whom he considered better qualified for the job. Aside from that, old Peter was of the opinion that the post should have gone to Harvey Hill, on duty now in his home state of North Carolina. His record was as good as that of Stonewall Jackson, the Georgian later wrote, but not being a Virginian, he was not so well advertised. There was, he thought, too much Virginia on the roster, and there were, in fact, apparent grounds for the complaint. Of the 15 most responsible assignments in the Army, 10 were held by natives of the Old Dominion, including Lee himself, Ewell and Hill, Stewart, Early and Johnson, Pickett, Rhodes and Heath, and Pendleton. Georgia had 2, Longstreet and McLaws. Texas had Hood, South Carolina, Anderson, and North Carolina, which furnished more than a quarter of Lee's troops, had only the newly promoted Pender, while Mississippi and Alabama, which furnished 3 brigades apiece, had no representative on the list at all. Lee, too, saw possible drawbacks and shortcomings to the arrangement, though not with regard to the states his leading generals came from. His concern was rather with the extent of the reorganization, which placed 2 of his 3 corps and 5 of his 9 divisions under men who previously had served either briefly or not at all in their present capacities. Moreover, though his brigadiers were the acknowledged backbone of his army, 6 of the 37 brigades were under new commanders, and another half dozen were under colonels whom he considered unready for promotion. This troubled him, though not as much as something else. Always in his mind was the missing Jackson, whose death had been the occasion for the shake-up now in progress, and of whom he said, "I never trouble myself to give him detailed instructions. The most general suggestions were all that he needed." Lee's proposed solution was characteristically simple. "We must all do more than formally," he told one general. And this applied as much to himself as it did to anyone, especially so far as detailed instructions were concerned. The sustaining factor was the Army itself, the foot soldiers, troopers, and cannoneers who had never failed him in the years since the last day of May 1862, when Davis gave him the command amid the half-fought confusion of 7 Pines. He was convinced, he declared within 10 days of the anniversary of his appointment, that our army would be invincible if it could be properly organized and officered. Of the troops themselves, the rank and file who carried the South's cause on their bayonets, he had no doubts at all. There never were such men in an army before, he said. They will go anywhere and do anything if properly led. Another known quantity, or at any rate an assumed one, was James Longstreet. My old war horse, Lee had called him after Sharpsburg, a battle which old Peter had advised against fighting. General, he'd said to Lee on entering Maryland, I wish we could stand still and let the damn Yankees come to us. But which at least was fought in the style he preferred, with the Confederates taking up a strong defensive position against which his superior blue forces were shattered like waves against a rock. Fredericksburg, where his corps had suffered fewer than 2,000 casualties while inflicting about 9,000, had confirmed his predilection in that respect, and he considered Chancellorsville the kind of flashy spectacle the South could ill afford. Facing what Abraham Lincoln called the arithmetic, he perceived that 4 more such battles in which the Confederates were outnumbered 2-1 and inflicted casualties at a rate of 3 for 4 would reduce Lee's army to a handful, while Hooker would be left with the number Lee had had at the outset. Disappointed by the rejection of his proposal that he take Hood and Pickett west for an assault on Rosecrans, the burly Georgian listened with disapproval as Lee announced his intention to launch an offensive in the east. He protested much as Reagan had done, but with no more success. Lee's mind was made up. So Longstreet contented himself with developing his theory, or as he thought advancing the stipulation, that the proposed invasion be conducted in accordance with his preference for receiving rather than delivering attack when the two armies came to grips, wherever that might be. As he put it later, quite as if he and Lee had been joint commanders of the army, I then accepted his proposition to make a campaign into Pennsylvania, provided it should be offensive in strategy but defensive in tactics, forcing the Federal Army to give us battle when we were in strong position and ready to receive them. Lee heard him out with a courtesy which he was accustomed to extend to all subordinates, but which in this case was mistaken for a commitment. He intended no such thing, of course, and when he was told years later that Longstreet had said he so understood him, he refused to believe that his former lieutenant had made the statement. But old Peter had said it, and he had indeed received that impression at the time, whereby trouble was stored up for all involved. In any case, once Lee had completed the groundwork for his plans, he wasted no time in putting them into execution. 4 days after his May 30th announcement of the Army's reorganization, and just 1 month after Chancellorsville, he started McLaws on the march up the south bank of the Rappahannock to Culpeper, near which Hood and Pickett had been halted on their return from Suffolk. Rhodes followed on June 4th, and Early and Johnson the next day, leaving Hill's 3 divisions at Fredericksburg to face alone the Union host across the river. Hooker's balloons were up and apparently spotted the movement, for the Bluecoats promptly effected a crossing below the town. It was rumored that Lee had expressed a willingness to swap Queens, Richmond for Washington, in case Hooker plunged south while his back was turned. However, the validity of the rumor was not tested. Hill reported the bridgehead was nothing he couldn't handle, and Lee took him at his word. Riding westward in the wake of Longstreet and Ewell, he joined them at Culpeper on June 7th. Stuart had been there more than 2 weeks already, getting his cavalry in shape for new exertions, and 2 days before Lee's arrival he had staged at nearby Brandy Station a grand review of 5 of his brigades, including, by way of finale, a mock charge on the guns of the horse artillery, which lent a touch of realism to the pageant by firing blank rounds as the long lines of grayjackets bore down on them with drawn sabers and wild yells. Stirred or frightened by this gaudy climax, several ladies fainted or pretended to faint in the grandstand which Jeb had set up for them along one side of the field. To his further delight, the Army commander agreed to let him restage the show for his benefit on the day after his arrival, though he insisted that the finale be omitted as a waste of powder and horseflesh. Despite this curtailment, the performance was a source of pride to the plumed chief of cavalry, who, as Lee rode home, was in all his glory. It was something more as well, for another result of this second review was that he still had most of his 10,000 troopers concentrated near Brandy on June 9th for what turned out to be the greatest cavalry battle of the war. 39-year-old Alfred Pleasanton, recently promoted to Major General as successor to George Stoneman, had 8 brigades of cavalry, roughly 12,000 men, grouped in 3 divisions under John Buford, David Gregg, and Judson Kilpatrick. All were West Pointers like himself, and all were of the new hell-for-leather style of horsemen who had learned to care more for results than they did for spit and polish. Buford, the oldest, was 37. Gregg was 30. Kilpatrick was 27. Supported by 2 brigades of infantry, Pleasanton moved upriver from Falmouth on June 8th with 6 of his brigades, which gave him a mounted force equal in strength to Stuart's, and crossed at dawn next morning at Beverly and Kelly's Fords above and below Rappahannock Station. Instructed to determine what Lee was up to there in the V of the rivers where John Pope had nearly come to grief the year before, he got over under cover of the heavy morning fog and surprised the rebel pickets who were driven back toward Brandy 5 miles away with the Blue Riders hard on their heels. And so it was that Stuart, who had pitched his headquarters tent on Fleetwood Hill overlooking the field where the 2 reviews were held, got his first sight of the Yankees at about the same time he received the first message warning him that they were over the river at Beverly Ford. 2 of his present 5 brigades under Rooney Lee and William E. Jones were already in that direction contesting the advance. Fitzlee's brigade was 7 miles north beyond the Hazel River, and the other 2 under Wade Hampton and Beverly Robertson were in the vicinity of Kelly's Ford, where John Pelham had fallen 12 weeks ago today. Stuart sent couriers to alert the brigades to the north and south, then rode forward to join the fight Lee and Jones were making about midway between Beverly Ford and Fleetwood Hill. However, he had no sooner gotten the situation fairly well in hand on that quarter of the field than he learned that another enemy column of equal strength had eluded the pickets at Kelly's Ford and was riding now into Brandy Station, 2 miles in his rear. The result, as he regrouped his troops arriving from north and south to meet the double threat, was hard fighting in the classic style, headlong charges met by headlong countercharges, with sabers, pistols, and carbines employed hand-to-hand to empty a lot of saddles. He lost Fleetwood Hill, retook it, lost it again, and again retook it. Near sundown, spotting rebel infantry on the march from Brandy, his own infantry had been engaged only lightly, Pleasanton fell back the way he'd come, effecting an orderly withdrawal. He had lost 936 men, including 86 taken prisoner, as compared to the Confederate total of 523, but he was well satisfied with his troopers and their day's work on the rebel side of the Rappahannock. Stuart expressed an equal, if not greater, satisfaction. After all, he had retained possession of the field along with 3 captured guns, and had inflicted a good deal more damage than he'd suffered, except perhaps in terms of pride. For there could be no denying that he had been surprised on his own ground, or that the Yankees had fought as hard, and for that matter as well, as his own famed gray horsemen, at least one of whom was saying even now that the Bluecoats had been successful because he and his fellows had been worried out all the preceding week by the grand reviews Jeb staged out of fondness for military foppery and display. One thing was clear to Stuart at any rate. Such exploits as he hoped to perform in the future, enhancing his already considerable reputation, were going to be more difficult to bring off than those he had accomplished in the days when the Blue Troopers were comparatively inept. Doubtless his solution was the same as the Army commanders. We must all do more than formerly, Lee had said, and for Jeb that meant more, even, than the 2 rides around McClellan. Approaching the field of battle that afternoon, Lee experienced the double shock of learning that his normally vigilant chief of cavalry had suffered a surprise, and of seeing his son Rooney being carried to the rear with an ugly leg wound. However, he did not let either development change his plans for the march northward, which were as follows. While Longstreet remained at Culpeper, in position to reinforce Hill in case Hooker tried to swamp him, Ewell would move into and down the Shenandoah Valley, preceded by Stuart's 6th Brigade of Cavalry, en route from southwest Virginia under Albert Jenkins. When Ewell reached the Potomac, he was to cross into Maryland and strike out for Pennsylvania without delay. Longstreet then would advance northward east of the Blue Ridge, thus preventing Union penetration of the passes, while Hill marched west from Fredericksburg and followed Ewell northward down the valley and over the Potomac, to be followed in turn by Longstreet, who would leave Stuart to guard the Blue Ridge passes until the combined advance of 60,000 butternut infantry into Pennsylvania caused the Washington authorities to call the Army of the Potomac northward across the river from which it took its name. Lee's plan was a bold one, but it had worked well against Lincoln and McClellan in September, and it seemed likely to work as well against Lincoln and Hooker 9 months later. The most questionable factor was Ewell, whose corps would not only set the pace for the rest of the army, but would also be the first to encounter whatever troubles lay in store for the Confederates in the North. In effect, this meant that he was being required to march and fight with the same fervor and skill as his former chief and predecessor. And whether he could ever become another Jackson was extremely doubtful, especially since he was not even the same Ewell, either to the ear or eye, who had fought under and alongside the dead Wizard of the Valley. In partial compensation for the loss of his leg, though this seemed in fact to bother him very little, either on horseback or afoot, he had made 2 acquisitions. One was religion, which tempered his language, and the other was a wife, which tempered his whole outlook. Formerly profane, he now was mild in manner. Formerly of modest means, he now was wealthy, having won the hand of a rich widow who in her youth had rejected his suit in order to marry a man with the undistinguished name of Brown. Now that she and her extensive property were in his charge, old Baldhead could scarcely believe his luck, and sometimes he forgot himself so far as to introduce her as my wife, Mrs. Brown. Whether this new, gentle Ewell would measure up to such high expectations was the subject of much discussion around the campfires of all 3 corps, particularly his own. But it soon appeared that all the worry had been for nothing. Out in the valley, the scene of former military magic, his firm grasp of strategy and tactics, coupled with a decisiveness of judgment, a good eye, and an eagerness to gather all the fruits of sudden victory, made it seem to former doubters that another Stonewall had indeed been found to lead the Second Corps and inspire the army. He moved northward on the day after Stuart's fight at Brandy Station, entered the valley by way of Chester Gap, and on June 13th, having divided his corps at Front Royal the day before, marched on Winchester with Early and Johnson, while Rhodes and the cavalry struck at Berryville, 10 miles east. Robert Milroy had 5,100 bluecoats at the former place, and Ewell was out to get them, along with an 1,800-man detachment at the latter, 10 miles east. As it turned out, the Berryville force made its getaway due to blunders by Jenkins, who was unfamiliar with the kind of work expected of horsemen in Lee's army. But the success of the operation against Winchester more than made up for the disappointment. Warned to fall back, Milroy chose to stand his ground, much as Banks had done in a similar predicament the year before. That hesitation had led to Banks's undoing, and so now did it lead to Milroy's. Charged by Early on the 14th from the west, he retreated northeastward in the darkness, only to be intercepted at dawn by Johnson some 4 miles up the Harper's Ferry Road at Stevenson's Depot, where he was routed. The Union general managed to escape with a couple of hundred of his troopers, but his unmounted men had no such luck in outrunning their pursuers, who gathered them up in droves. Johnson himself, called Old Clubby by his soldiers because he preferred to direct their combat maneuvers with a heavy walking stick instead of a sword, asserted happily that he had taken 30 prisoners with his opera glass before he ended his private chase by falling off his horse and into Old Pecan Creek. Milroy was presently removed from command by Lincoln, but that was a rather superfluous gesture, since practically all of his command had already been removed from him by Ewell. The total bag, in addition to the infliction of 443 casualties on the immediate field of battle, was 700 sick and 3,358 able-bodied prisoners, 23 fine guns, and some 300 well-stocked wagons, all at a cost of 269 Confederate casualties, less than 50 of whom were killed. Ewell's triumph over Milroy was even greater than Jackson's had been over Banks on that same field, a fact that was not lost on the men of the Second Corps, whose final doubts as to the worth of their new commander were forgotten. Moreover, like Stonewall, old Baldhead did not sit down to enjoy in leisure the spoils and glory he had won. Pushing Jenkins forward to the Potomac before sundown, he had Rhodes follow on June 16th for a crossing at Williamsport, Maryland, where a halt was called to allow the other two divisions to catch up for a combined advance into Pennsylvania. Lee had already put the other two corps in motion. On June 15th, while Ewell was gathering prisoners in the woods and fields near Winchester, Longstreet started north from Culpeper, and Hill, who reported that Hooker had abandoned his West Bank bridgehead and withdrawn his army from its camps around Falmouth the day before, apparently for a concentration at or near Manassas, where he would stand to thwart Lee's path in case the unpredictable Virginian launched a direct drive on Washington from Culpeper, left Fredericksburg under instructions to follow Ewell's line of march to the Potomac. 2 days later, Lee himself moved north, establishing headquarters at Berryville on the 19th, while Stuart fought a series of thunderous cavalry engagements at Aldie, Middleburg, and Upperville, in all of which he was successful at keeping his hard-riding blue opponents from discovering what was afoot beyond the mountains that screened the valley from the Piedmont. Pleased with Jebb's recovery of his verve, the Army commander listened with sympathy to the cavalry chief's suggestion that he leave 2 brigades of horsemen to plug the gaps of the Blue Ridge and move with the other 3 into Hooker's rear, the better to annoy and delay him when he started north across the Potomac. Lee approved in principle, but warned that once it became clear that Fighting Joe was crossing the river, Stuart must immediately cross himself and take his place on our right flank, where he would be needed to screen the northward advance and keep the invading army informed of the movements of the defenders. Aware of his former cadet's fondness for adventure at any price, Lee sent him written instructions on June 22nd, repeating the warning that he must not allow himself to be delayed in joining the rest of the column when the time came. The next day, when Stuart reported the Bluecoats lying quiet in their camps north of Manassas, and suggested that a crossing of the Potomac to the east of them by his 3 Mobile brigades would help to mislead Hooker as to Lee's intentions, Lee followed his first message with a second, re-emphasizing the need for close observance of the Federals, but adding, "You will, however, be able to judge whether you can pass around the army without hindrance, doing them all the damage you can, and cross the river east of the mountains. In either case, after crossing the river, you must move on and feel the right of Ewell's troops, collecting information, provisions, etc." The dispatch ended on a note of caution. "Be watchful and circumspect in all your movements," Lee told Stuart. Meanwhile, the infantry was marching rapidly. By June 24th, Ewell's main body had cleared Hagerstown, and his lead division was at Chambersburg, 20 miles beyond the Pennsylvania line, with orders to press on to the Susquehanna. Presumably the North was in turmoil, having been warned that the penetration would be deep. It is said, the Richmond Whig had reported the week before, that an artificial leg ordered some months ago awaits General Ewell's arrival in the city of Philadelphia.